Welcome to an episode of Global Jewish Perspectives. I'm Phyllis Zimbler-Miller, and I'm very lucky today to have someone who's actually calling in from Israel, where he's visiting, Jerome Marcus. He's going to tell you a little bit about himself, although I'm just going to say he's a Philadelphia lawyer, and then I have an affinity for Philadelphia lawyers because my husband started his professional career as a Philadelphia lawyer, moved to Los Angeles, where for many years he wore the garb of a Philadelphia lawyer till he finally became a Los Angeles lawyer. Okay, Jerome, the reason I invited you on this show was that I read your op-ed piece in Tuesday's print Wall Street Journal. The article's title was Israel Needs Unconditional Surrender. And I was so taken by your article. And also because it refers to unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany in 1945, another area that I'm particularly interested in, that I said, I have to have him on this new show. So first, tell us a little bit more about, you have other hats that you wear, and then why you wrote the article, and just an overview, and then we'll talk about it.
Sure. Well, first of all, Phyllis, thank you for very, very much for having me on your show. I am a lawyer. I confess to that. I aspire to be a Philadelphia lawyer, which is a very, very lofty status that doesn't leave you when you leave the city. I spent most of my career practicing as a civil litigator, but I'm now the president of the Deborah Project, which is a public interest law firm that defends the civil rights of Jews in America and education. So I do that. I write about the law of war. I write about the legal issues facing Israel and the Jewish community around the world. And I think, like most Jews, I'm deeply, deeply committed to the state of Israel. And I don't want to say worried, because I think worried suggests the possibility that something might happen to the state of Israel. I mean, things will happen to the state of Israel. The state of Israel is going to be here when this conflict is over. There's no way that it will not prevail over Hamas. And if it has to, it will prevail over Hamas and Hezbollah. And if it has to, it will prevail over Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran. It will get a lot bloodier and more awful if it has to do all those things. But it will prevail. I have no doubt of that. So here I am in Jerusalem. We came, my wife and I, about a week ago, because we really just couldn't not be here. We have a place here. And so we're here, and we're trying to help in the ways that we can. Israel is, I said to my children when they asked why we were going now, that I think I had this image. I mean, I've been to Israel many, many, many times over many, many, many years. 3 of our children studied here. 2 of them went to the army. To our disappointment, they came back to America, or we would be living here full-time or almost full-time. But I think many people, and I include myself in this, had an image of Israel as really the most advanced first world country where everything was ready and everything was organized. Maybe people weren't so foolish to believe that about Israel, but what I've realized in the last few weeks is, and I think this is an idea that other people have articulated, that in many ways it's 1948 all over again. By which I do not mean that in 1948 the success of Israel as the ability of Israel to exist as an independent state was in doubt. Now it's not in doubt. But what's the same is that there's just a lot of stuff that needs to be done, and if you show up and say, I want to help, they just sort of say, well, there's this, just go over there and start doing that. And there's an immense amount of that going on. I'm sure that those of your viewers who care about Israel are probably being inundated with emails asking for financial support. And in some ways, that's a little scary. It makes you think, well, wait a minute, why don't they have enough of this stuff? Why are they asking for it now? And why are they asking American Jews, right? When the United States goes to war, it doesn't send out emails saying, please donate bandages. And the answer really was conveyed to a friend of mine in his discussion with an American Army logistics officer who said, you know, if we had to call up our entire reserves, we wouldn't have enough stuff either, because you don't keep stuff sitting around in warehouses. It would be very wasteful to keep stuff in warehouses for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. I was talking a few days ago to a guy who's a captain in the infantry and who was stationed in the north, who'd come back for a day to check on his office. And he pointed out to me something which is, I think, probably obvious, and that is that this military operation, this war, is the largest logistical operation the state of Israel has ever conducted. They've got multiple hundreds of thousands of soldiers on two borders at the same time. And there's a tremendous, tremendous amount of stuff that just has to get moved. So, and I mean everything from missiles and tanks to bars of soap and coffee and blankets and everything in between. So we're here, we came to visit just because we wanted to help. But what's astounding to me is how much the entire country, even the people who are not in uniform, have committed themselves. I mean, so I got a very funny WhatsApp, which I think probably many other people got, which said the Messiah has actually arrived. Not that he's close or that he's coming, but he's arrived. And how do we know? Because multiple thousands of Haredim have enlisted.
Yes.
And
wait, could you? I would like to know a little bit more. Can I interrupt you for a minute for you to explain?
You interrupt me whenever you want.
I saw that news headline and then I tried to read more and I couldn't find more. Explain what that means.
Okay, so as many of your viewers will know, roughly somewhere between 10 and 20% of Israel's population is what we would refer to as ultra-Orthodox. They're Haredi Jews. Haredi means that they tremble. They tremble because they're constantly in the presence of God and they want to make sure they get every detail of compliance with Jewish law exactly right. And Israel, in one of the many divisions of Israel, which had completely riven it and made it completely distracted and bitter until October 7th, has a great deal of difficulty figuring out how to deal with the Haredim. They have the male Haredim are exempt from service in the army.
Okay, wait. Let's remind everyone that of the military service in Israel. Let's go through that.
As a general matter, military service is universal, at least for Jews. It's not universal for Arabs.
In Israel.
In Israel, right.
Although they can serve, right? And I know the Druze
can if they wish. They absolutely can. I don't know if it's universal, if it's mandatory for Druze, but the Druze community is very much aligned with the Jewish community here. And there are very many brave soldiers from the Druze community and soldiers and policemen and border patrol people who have, within the last year or two, given their lives in defense of the security of the state of Israel. But the Haredi Jewish community, the Haredi community, is exempt because they're learning in yeshiva, and the argument was, well, they're doing something very important too, so they're exempt. In addition, they get stipends to learn. And for the people who are not Haredi, that's a source of tremendous dissatisfaction. So everybody else goes to the army, and everybody else endangers themselves, or at least takes up 2+ years of their lives serving in the army.
Let's clarify: we're talking men and women,
and women.
Right after high school, before they go to college.
Yes, they graduate from high school, and when they're 18, they go to the army, which, at least in my experience with my sons, the best place for an 18-year-old male is in the army, being awakened at 3 o'clock in the morning to run around in the rain. It's very important. But and I mean that completely seriously.
No, I know that you do.
Best way to grow up an 18-year-old boy. But so the Haredi community is exempt, and they get stipends to learn. And that is a source of tremendous friction among the Jewish community in Israel. But
what's happening now?
What's happening now, this threat to everyone in Israel, and I'll expand on that in a minute, has really led to at least some degree of enlightenment. And that's obviously I have a side on this dispute. I'm not with the people who think that Haredi exemption should continue. But it's difficult to figure out how to make it go away, and how not to drag people in the streets, and how to not do unpleasant things that one would rather not do. But one of the things that this slaughter on October 7th made clear to people is that, and it's unfortunately, tragically, a lesson that the Jewish people have to learn over and over and over again, which is what we say at the Passover Seder. In every generation, people rise up against us to destroy us.
Yes.
And when it says us, it doesn't only mean people who walk around with one of these. It means every Jew. And so secular, not secular, religious, very religious, completely observant of every Jewish law or not observant of any Jewish laws. It doesn't matter. Our enemies don't care. And it's tragic in my mind that it takes that to unify the Jewish people. But if one good thing has come out of this conflict so far, it is that at least for now, the Jewish people are unified. You watch Israeli TV and there are ads that say there's no right and there's no left. And when they say that, there's a whole bunch of people who say it, and they're visibly identifiable as Haredi Jews, secular people, and hipsters, and religious Zionists, everybody. They're just saying, we're done with that, at least for right now. We're not talking about that. We're not doing that. We're all together, and we're going to do what needs to be done. Okay, so that's sort of that's the background. You also, I don't know if you want me to talk now about my piece or if there's something else.
Yeah, no, I want to talk about, okay, so in order to protect all those people and in effect, Jews everywhere in the world, why was your piece arguing that we need an unconditional surrender from Hamas?
Right. So Israel's policy since, let's go back a little bit. Israel took control of the Gaza Strip in 1967, at the same time that it took control of the Sinai Peninsula and Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank.
Otherwise known as the Six-Day War, right?
Otherwise known as 1967 was the Six-Day War, and that war ended with Israel in control of all of that territory. So the Gaza Strip has, for a long time, since before 1948, been the home to many, many Arabs, and they remained there after 1967. Israel certainly didn't drive them out. But on the contrary, Israel built Jewish communities there, which thought that they were living among Arabs. But in 2005, Israel decided to withdraw from the Gaza Strip, and they uprooted in all the Jewish communities there. They literally took graves out of the ground and coffins out of the ground, and moved all the Jews who lived there out and made it Judenrein. There were no Jews living there.
Okay, let's just make this really clear, because ironically, my husband and I were in Sderot, probably mispronounced it, right when that happened. We were literally there when the Israeli soldiers came south to remove the Jewish settlers from Gaza in 2005.
So
no Israeli control since 2005. Go ahead.
Well, okay, so there's an important qualification to that, which I'll get to in a minute. In 2005, there was no Israeli control. We left, and we said, here you go, it's yours. We left communities, we left houses, we left greenhouses. There were American Jews who donated tens of millions of dollars in order to hand over this infrastructure for farming and industry to the Arabs and teach them how to use it. And the response of the Arabs was to destroy it. They literally tore it apart with their hands. In 2005, the area was controlled by the Palestinian Authority under the Oslo Accords. And if you'll forgive me with a footnote, at the time that was done, the Jews on the right in Israel opposed it and thought it was bad. And there were many, many soldiers in the army who were on the right and thought it was bad. And it was bad to leave. It was wrong. It was wrong to withdraw the Jews from that area. And there was some discussion about whether the soldiers would obey orders. And everyone agreed that not obeying orders, what's called in Hebrew sarvanut, which means refusal, was absolutely intolerable. You can't run an army where soldiers are making their own decisions about whether they're going to obey orders. And there was not any organized refusal. And there are videos, you can find them on YouTube, of soldiers weeping while they're pulling the Jews out of their houses. But they did what they were ordered to do. Fast forward to last summer, when the Jews on the left...
Wait, let's not skip Hamas getting control, being voted in.
I won't. I'll come back to that. I just want to make the sarvanut point, which is that in the dispute in Israel, before October 7th, when there was argument about whether the judicial reform should be adopted or other legislation should be adopted that was advanced by the coalition that appointed Bibi Netanyahu as prime minister, the people on the left did refuse. They said, we can't tolerate these things. Working for a country or serving the military of a country that does these things is intolerable, it's undemocratic, it's fascist, it's criminal, and they refused.
Okay.
And they refused to show up.
Which things you didn't? Can you just half a sentence?
Half a sentence. So there was a campaign for judicial reform, which attempted to undo a judicial revolution that had been created in the 1990s by an Israeli chief justice who decided to change the law on his own in Israel and to create a series of powers on the part of the Israeli Supreme Court to overturn legislation and executive action if he thought it was unreasonable. There were a series of other things, but that's probably the best example. Okay, so to go back to Gaza, 2005, Israel hands over the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian Authority. In 2006, there were elections, and among the voters of Gaza. So those elections were characterized by a fair amount of violence. There was essentially a competition between Hamas and Fatah. Fatah is an arm of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Hamas is a creation of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Islamist organization with roots really in Egypt. And Egypt is frankly no more fond of the Muslim Brotherhood than Israel is. It's an organization that seeks to promote Islam as a state, that there should be a single ummah, a nation of Islam, and to enforce that really throughout the world, but certainly in the Middle East, everywhere in the Middle East, including the place where I'm sitting, which is Jerusalem. So Hamas won that election in part by getting more votes and in part by murdering the people who were running against them. And Hamas is explicitly committed to the destruction of the state of Israel and the murder of any Jews, at least any Jews who live on this territory, if not all Jews everywhere. The Hamas charter explicitly says that. And Hamas has, since it was elected and took power, of course, they were elected in 2007, and they follow the understanding of democracy advanced by the president of Turkey, which is democracy is a bus that you take until it gets to your destination and then you get off. So they had an election in 2007 and they have not had an election since then.
Wait, was the election was in 2006 or 2007?
I think it was 2000. I believe it was 2006.
Something like 2006, and then they took power in 2007. It was something like that, right?
But they are in a declared the Hamas government, Hamas, to the extent that it is a government, is in a declared state of war with the state of Israel. Yes. So I say all this because you pointed out, and you're correct, that Israel has not occupied Gaza since 2005. They have, however, maintained a blockade around Gaza. And the reason that they've maintained a blockade around Gaza is that the Hamas is constantly trying to import weapons from Iran, which is constantly trying to supply the weapons. With your tax dollars paying for those weapons, because we give American tax dollars. We give our tax dollars to Iran, and Iran spends the money buying weapons to kill Jews. So those weapons are constantly being smuggled, or efforts are being made to smuggle those weapons into the Gaza Strip, and Israel maintains a blockade around the Gaza Strip in exactly the same way, for example, that President Lincoln maintained a naval blockade around the South during the Civil War in order to try to prevent the area that we were fighting from getting more weapons. The blockade is also maintained by Egypt, because Egypt also shares a border with the Gaza Strip. Nobody seems to be particularly concerned about the fact that Egypt has a blockade against Gaza, but they do, and it's for the same reason. They are no more fond of the Muslim Brotherhood than we are, and so they maintain that blockade. So we have not controlled Gaza, but we have attempted, by maintaining a blockade around it, to restrict or eliminate the flow of weapons in. That doesn't mean we let nothing in. On the contrary, there are, in periods of quiet, everything that's not weapons does go in. Of course, even then, concrete, building supplies, food, fuel does go in, and Hamas takes it and uses it as it sees fit. One of the difficulties with the cry for humanitarian aid to Gaza is that it's not going to reach the human beings in Gaza. It's going to reach Hamas in Gaza, and Hamas is going to decide how it gets distributed. Israel's a military spokesman distributed a couple of days ago photographs of tanks holding 500,000 liters of fuel. So there's plenty of fuel in Gaza. It's just that nobody who's not a Hamasnik has any of it. So the reason that I called for unconditional surrender of Hamas is this. Hamas has been in power since 2007. Its charter explicitly commits it not just to war with Israel, but to the destruction of the state of Israel. And they have, at times, agreed to truces with Israel, but they are essentially only opportunities to reload. They are opportunities for them to recover from the last military confrontation with Israel and get ready for the next military confrontation with Israel. The slaughter of October 7th was an event that was planned over the course of 2 years. And there's really a stunning quote from an interview. It was run in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago by one of the high-ranking Hamas officials who was being interviewed on Russian television. And what he said was that we fooled everyone. For the last 2 years, we made them think that we were interested in governing the Gaza Strip, but we weren't. We were only interested in preparing for this. And this, please.
I read that quote. I wish I had it in front of me because it said, made people think that we were caring for the people in Palestine. Right. We weren't. But
we're not. We're not. Yeah. They don't care.
Yes.
And part of that, the fact that they don't care for the people in Palestine or wherever that is, or Gaza, is a very important point, because the misery that the Gazans are experiencing is a function of the fact that they are being held hostage. So by Hamas. If you were to ask most people who were the hostages being held by Hamas, they would say, well, there are 200 and whatever Israelis or Frenchmen or whoever other unfortunates happened to be there when the Hamas came in. But that's not at all complete. Every non-combatant in the Gaza Strip is a Hamas hostage. And Israel called for non-combatants to leave the north, because that's where the northern part of the Gaza Strip, and go to the south, because Hamas is based in the north, and the destruction of Hamas is going to be carried out in the north. And Israel told civilians, get away so that you don't get hurt. Hamas will not let people get away. The Israeli army has released recordings of people inside the Strip saying, we're trying to go south, but we can't. They won't let us go. And people who try to go, they shoot. So those people are just as much hostages as the Jews. So to be very blunt, there's no way to reach peace with these people, with Hamas. They are very clear and they're very committed. They don't want peace with the Jewish state. They do not want and will not agree to two nations living side by side in peace. It's not what they want. They view the presence of Jews on the land of the state of Israel as an insult to Islam. And they cannot tolerate it. And the only way, in my view, the only possible way to make this stop is to defeat them in such a way that they have to acknowledge that they're defeated. Islam, go ahead.
Yes. And at this point right now, I want you to just talk about what you talked about the only way to deal with Nazi Germany was to have an unconditional surrender for the same reason.
Right. Unfortunately, as evil and as powerful as the Nazis were, we're dealing here with, frankly, with a force that's more deeply rooted. If you think about German history, I mean, Germany as a nation was created in 1871 by Bismarck. And
several different little German states came
Prussia and Bavaria, and he put them together and he made a country. And it certainly had a shared culture before then, right? I mean, Beethoven was a German, and that was before
language.
Bismarck. And language and ideas, but it was, at least to all outward appearances, a civilized country. And it came together in the 19th century. And the appetite that it had, stoked by the Nazis, but certainly not entirely created by them, was to dominate Europe.
Yes.
I mean, if you read the history of England in the first decade of the 20th century. Churchill and others are keenly aware of military buildup in Germany. They understand that they're threatened by it, and they understand that Germany poses a threat to the well-being and the independence and the financial independence of other countries in Europe, and they know that they need to confront it. And what they concluded after having fought the First World War and then 20 years of more or less peace, and then the outbreak again of war in 1939 after it had ended in 1918, was we need to make it clear to the Germans that they cannot do this anymore. And so the goal of the Allied powers, the United States, Great Britain, France, and Russia, mostly the United States, Great Britain, and Russia, but also France to some extent, was essentially to break the neck of the Nazis, not of Germany, but of the Nazis, so that it would be absolutely clear that the effort that the Nazis had mounted to dominate Europe had failed. And the Germans got that message. In 1945, they got that message. And the purpose of the demand for unconditional surrender was to make it impossible for Germany to do it again, right? They'd done it in 1918. They'd actually attempted in previous examples, previous wars after the War of 1871 also was an example, but there have been other exercises of aggression, both inside Europe and in whatever one thinks of them. They were bad things, but they were European colonies. There was a Belgian colony in Africa. There was a German colony in Africa. There were French colonies in Africa. And there was a war going on inside those colonies, which was really just an extension of the conflict or the struggle between those European nations. And the goal of the demand for unconditional surrender was to make it absolutely clear that Germany was not going to succeed in its effort to dominate its neighbors. And if you look at the history of the very end of the Second World War, where there were still German armies intact, there were officers of those armies, general officers of those armies, who were attempting to negotiate separate peaces with the Americans, and with
the Allies.
Usually, but it was really with the Americans, because they knew that the Russians would have no patience for this and would slaughter everybody got their hands on. So everybody wanted to surrender to the Americans because it was a good recipe for having a longer life. But none of those separate pieces was allowed, because it had to be that there was an explicit acknowledgement that what the Germans had tried was a failure and could not succeed. And exactly the same terms were demanded of the Japanese, where there was, frankly, a deeper, longer lasting, and more racial understanding of what it is they were trying to do. And the divine status of the Japanese emperor, which is something that they believed in until 1945. But that divine status goes away when your emperor gets marched up onto the deck of a destroyer and he has to sit down and sign a piece of paper that says, "I lose." And so that image of the emperor himself and his generals signing a document that says, "We lose, we lost," was a way of, if you'll forgive me, educating their people that the thing that they had tried to do, not only that it was morally wrong, but that also that it wouldn't work, that it hadn't worked. And so my suggestion that Israel identify as a goal the unconditional surrender of Hamas was an allusion to that. Now, having suggested it, I don't remember whether I said this in the piece or not, but you have to acknowledge that it ain't never going to happen. None of the Hamas leaders would do that. First of all, the highest ranking leaders are all living comfortably in Qatar, and they're not under a pile of rubble in Gaza, and they will not be. And they have no incentive to unconditionally surrender anything. And the people who are in Gaza and who are fighting this fight, to the extent that they're still alive, are not going to unconditionally surrender. Hopefully, none of them will be alive when this conflict is over, and so there will be no one to surrender. In fact, the same situation happened in Germany. There was no civil authority to surrender. The surrender documents that were cited in the article were military surrenders. They were surrenders by generals of armies. So a general of an army or any officer of an army can surrender himself and the soldiers under his command. That's not the same as the country surrendering. There never was a national surrender, even though it was demanded. What happened was the Allied powers took complete control of Germany. They dismantled. There was no government of Germany on May 9th, 1945. Hitler was dead. His other immediate subordinates were either on the lam or in custody or dead. And there was no civil authority to sign a national surrender document. The Allied powers created a government, and then they had elections, and then we got Konrad Adenauer, and Konrad Adenauer was someone who acknowledged that what Germany had done was not going to happen again. And that's how we transformed an enemy into an ally. West Germany has been in West Germany, as it then was, from after the Berlin Wall was created by the Russians. West Germany was our ally. East Germany was Russia's ally. And then when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and Germany became a single country, it went to the West. It's a Western country.
I want to just say this for people who don't know. American troops have been in Germany since the end of World War II.
Yes.
And continue today with their families. And my husband and I, as newlyweds, were stationed in Munich from September 1970 to May 1972. He was in military intelligence. He was an officer coming out of ROTC at Michigan State. And eventually I got my own clearance and got to type secret reports. But the point is, we, as opposed to World War I, the Allies ensured that the Germans would remember not to start anything. And also that the Russians would know what really, my husband just had a letter to the editor in the Wall Street Journal about we were protecting the Fulda Gap, protecting where it was expected the Russians could come across from East Germany.
Look, so, I think as a general matter, I think as a gentleman, you and I, it sounds like, agree, and we are, at least I am, I won't label you, but I'm a neocon. So you know the joke about neoconservatives, right? Conservative means conservative and neo means Jewish.
Oh,
but
I didn't know that.
But I am a neocon in the sense that I don't believe that it's possible for the United States of America to isolate itself from the world. I think that, I think most people would agree that the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a cataclysm, but some people think it was right to withdraw and it was just done poorly. I don't think it's possible for the United States to not maintain and project power around the world. If the United States doesn't do it, other people will do it, and they're badder than we are, and it will be worse for more people. And I think that we frankly have no choice. It's not just that it's, America's burden or the white man's burden or anything like that. It's simply that as a matter of our own self-defense, we have interests around the world. We have interests around the world. We can be threatened around the world, and we can be threatened from any place around the world in the United States, as we learned, on December 7th of 1941 and September 11th of 2001. And not to mention in 1993 and many other times. So, and the many, many, many other instances when American intelligence defeated efforts to blow things up and kill people in the United States on U.S. territory. And I don't believe it's possible for the United States to survive as a country and to achieve its own internal goals unless we maintain power around the world. Your husband's deployment in Europe in 1945. 1970, sorry.
Not that old.
Right. We're not that old, right? Is an example of that, and it's something that I think the United States has very, very much lost track of. We came away from Vietnam, rubbing our boo-boos and feeling as if we wanted to go fight a war and come home. And I mean, if you look at the history of World War II, there were plenty of people saying that in 1942 and 1943 and 1944 as well, that they didn't want to have to do this. And it's not surprising that they don't want to have to do it. And, it's easy for me as a 64-year-old man who never served in the military and never done anything more dangerous than clean the gutters of his house to say that we have to be prepared to go to war all over the world. But my point is not we have to do that because we have to defend noble ideals. I do think we're defending noble ideals when we do that, but I think that it's necessary because we either fight them over there or we fight them over here. It's not a question of do we fight them or do we not fight them. We're going to fight them. The only question is where. And the forces that Israel is confronting in the Gaza Strip, and which it probably will have to confront in the north, are in many ways exactly the same forces that the United States confronted in the 1940s, right? The Mufti of Jerusalem, who was an Islamist, was a good friend and an ally of Hitler, and that's not just because they shared a common interest in hating the Jews. It's because there are ideas about the relationship between the individual and the state that they shared. Islam, as a political Islamism,
Yes.
leaving aside Islam,
right.
But certainly Islamism is not a democratic political idea any more than National Socialism is a democratic idea.
National Socialism being Nazis, just Nazi, right? The official name for Nazis being the shorthand.
The relationship between the individual and the government in an Islamist world is not all that different from the relationship between the individual and the government in a Nazi world. And not surprisingly, the relationship between those things and the Jews is exactly the same, which is their enemies. And they're enemies that should be destroyed in not just completely, but cruelly and brutally, and in a way that sends a message to every other Jew that they must live in fear until they, at least in Islam, you could convert. No Jew could convert to be a Nazi. That didn't work. And that's what we're dealing with. That's what we're dealing with. And my article was meant to suggest that the only way to confront that is to confront it absolutely. There's no way to reach a compromise with these people. Israel's policy since 2005 has been to periodically go into Gaza, shear off the top few levels of Hamas leadership, make a significant dent in their arsenal, and go home, and thereby buy a few years of peace. The Israelis called it mowing the grass. And every few years you have to go mow the grass. And Israel, from what used to be the left to what used to be the right, is now completely unified in realizing that we can't mow the grass. We have to uproot the grass and sow the ground with salt. So no more ground, the way the Romans did with Carthage, so that there won't be any more grass growing. Not that there shouldn't be a country. There could be a country, but the things that were growing in Hamas land, the force to attack the Jews, that can't happen anymore. I mean, there's no such thing as forever in any military or political world. But what Israel is about to do in Gaza, I hope, will be definitive, at least for a long time. I mean, if you read the book of Judges, if you ever read the book of Judges from beginning to end, it starts to get a little repetitive, because it's like, okay, there was a problem. The Jews were disunited. Then they had an enemy. They appointed this guy. He unified the Jews. They went out and fought, and there was peace for 20 years. There was peace for 30 years, and there was peace for 40 years. And then it happens all over again, and it happens, and it happens, and it happens, and it happens, and that's the whole book of Judges. And in some ways, that's Jewish history, right? We're not gonna have perpetual peace like Kant talked about when we finish in Gaza, but we should be able to destroy these people so that these people can't reconstitute and come back and do this to us again. And I think Israel is unified in realizing that has to happen. And my point in the article is you've got to give it a name, and it has to be a name that has legal consequences, because at the end of the day, what Israel is doing has to have legal consequences.
Yes.
Right? Israel is going to conduct this operation according to international law. And at the end of it, there's going to be some legal administration of this area. There's going to be a government there. There has to be a government there. Israel, Netanyahu has been quoted, President Herzog has been quoted as saying Israel has absolutely no desire to govern 2 million Arabs in the Gaza Strip, and they don't want to. I know they don't want to. They said it. Nobody that I know of Israel wants to do that. On the other hand, there has to be a government, right? The sewage system has to work. There has to be electricity. There has to be schools. There has to be something. And how that's going to be done, I don't know. I made a suggestion that Israel could perhaps rely on its Abraham Accord partners. I don't know that they have any more willingness to do it than Israel does. The Arabs who live in the Gaza Strip are not the friends of Bahrain or the United Arab Emirates or Egypt, which is not a part of the Arab Accords, or Saudi Arabia. But all of those, which are some of the countries that are parties to, or they're at peace with Israel, and some of them are parties to the Abraham Accords. But all of those countries recognize that for Iran to have a foothold in Gaza is bad, and that's what Hamas has been. And when Hamas is destroyed, and that foothold is destroyed, something is going to have to take its place, and it's going to be a government. There's going to be it has to be some sort of government. How that's done, I don't know. I made a suggestion. Maybe it's a good idea, maybe it's not a good idea, but it has to start with the acknowledgement that the Hamas regime is no more. There is no more Hamas. There is no more Hamas charter. That's not what governs this area. There has to be something else. And the demand for unconditional surrender is to give a name to the legal status of not this.
As we come to the end of this episode, is there anything that normal people, everyday people can do to help with this? Or do we just have to wait for the outcome of what happens and then be on the side of in favor of a government in Gaza that is, I don't want to use the word democratic, it would be nice, but is much better than the terror of Hamas, and which will allow for the people of Palestine, of Gaza, to be actually cared for and learn to care for themselves.
What can any of us do? Us Americans sitting in comfortable rooms far away, right? None of us is going to take a weapon and go and cross the fence and go into Gaza and take care of business. But what I see, I mentioned when you asked me to identify myself that I'm the president, what do I do for a living, or not for a living, is I'm the president of the Deborah Project, which is a public interest law firm that represents, that defends the civil rights of Jews in education. And as your viewers, and I'm sure you know, Jews in education today are in a very, very, very strange and bad place. And the reason for that is that there are people present on university campuses and in high schools and elsewhere who actually have the temerity to say that what happened in Israel on October 7th is good, which is just astounding. And there are demonstrations in favor of what Hamas did. The argument is the Jews are strangers to this land. They colonized it. They have to be expelled. And what happened on October 7th is necessary for that. And so that's a good thing. So setting babies on fire, please.
No, I want to just remind our listeners, because there are people who don't know this. I'm taking a history of Jewish biblical interpretation, and we're looking at 2,000 years, of course, 2,000 years. Jews have been in that land where Jerome is sitting right now for thousands of years. Islam, the actual religion, only started with Muhammad in 600 something.
Seventh century.
Seventh century, 600 something. So I just want to remind people of this very important historical fact that many, many people forget. Now go ahead.
Please. So, I mean, what you just said is very important, that the argument in favor of October 7th, as obscene as it is, rests in part on profound hatred for Jews, because there's just no other way that you could defend the doing of what was done. But it also rests on an idea that Jews are strangers to the land of Israel, which is historically false and ridiculous. When Yasser Arafat was talking to Yimach Shemo, when he was talking to Bill Clinton in 2000, and said, there was never a Jewish temple in Jerusalem. Bill Clinton, say whatever else you will about him, had been to Sunday school. And he said, I know there was a Jewish temple here because Jesus turned over the temple, tables of the money changers who were at the temple. So it's a historical fact. And the Jews were exiled from the land of Israel in the year 70 by the Romans. 72. But they were never completely gone. They have perpetually tried to come back. They have tried to come back every time they could. I finished a book a few months ago about the Duke of Naxos, who was some Yid who lived in Turkey in the 16th century, who was a wealthy guy, and he was a court Jew. And he kept trying to buy Tiberia, because he wanted to make a Jewish colony there. And if you look at the history of the land of Israel from the time that the Romans kicked us out until the late 19th century, when Zionism became an active political force again, you will see that there was never a time when there were no Jews here, and there was never a time when Jews did not yearn to return. If you're an observant Jew, even if you're not an observant Jew, if you look at the prayers that the Jews say, and this is the prayers of all Jews, not just Orthodox Jews, they all contemplate a return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. There's the famous story of I think it was Napoleon who walked by a synagogue on Tisha B'Av, which is the holiday. It's the day on the Jewish calendar in which the destruction of the temples is mourned.
Both temples.
Both temples, the first and second temples, and the Jews were doing what they do on that day, which is wailing. Right? There are tragic poems that are recited, and he said, "What is that noise?" And he was answered by someone who said, "Well, the Jews are mourning the loss of their temple." And this was the late 18th century. And he said, any group of people who can mourn the loss of their territory for 1,800 years is going to get it back. And we have never lost our yearning to return. We have never abandoned this country, this land, this physical space. The idea that the Jews are not indigenous to the land of Israel is a lie. And at the end of the day, it's an anti-Semitic lie, because it's a lie about the Jews that's meant to delegitimize what the Jews are and how they understand themselves. So the protests, quote unquote, the violence that we're seeing on campuses, right? I mean, there were Jewish students who we don't even know if they were, Zionists or pro-Israel or not. They're just students, Jews, who were sitting in the library at Cooper Union yesterday, and they were terrified and had to go hide behind locked doors because there was a Palestinian demonstration that broke into the library, found the Jews. The doors were locked, but they were banging on the doors. These people had to be escorted out of the building through a tunnel by police.
I didn't hear that.
Because, you just look it up. Just Google Cooper Union and Palestine. You'll find it right away. My wife and I are in Israel, but what we're doing, because of what we do with the Deborah Project, we've been getting phone calls from parents and Jewish students all over the country, sadly, many of them in California. And I say sadly only because California is 10 hours behind Israel. So we're up all night talking to people because it's the afternoon in California. Let me just get rid of this. So the Jewish connection has never been lost. And the effort to attack Israel and the enterprise of the creation of a Jewish state in Israel is a profoundly anti-Semitic exercise, and it's all over the place. So when you ask, what can people do now? They can oppose that, right? There are American political officials, there are American school board officials, there are walkouts, whatever that is, for a high school student, that are being organized by organizations of advocates for Hamas, who are going into high schools and encouraging students to protest. And there are sympathetic administrators in school districts all over the country who are not just allowing this, but encouraging it, giving excused absences, giving class credit for attendance at these demonstrations. These are local issues. So yes, none of us can go get a rifle and go through the fence and kill the murderers from Hamas. But we can do this. You can be conscious of what your local school district is doing, or the school district in the city near where you live. In Philadelphia, this is going on. In Los Angeles, it's going on. We're representing people all over the country where students are being manipulated by grown-ups into defending the most abject atrocities. State government resources are being used simply to advocate for the murder of Jews. And that's evil, and it's something that American Jews can find and oppose right now without leaving the comfort of your home. You can organize in your synagogues, you can organize your neighbors. We represent people in Westfield, New Jersey, which is a small community in Westfield, New Jersey, where one member of the school board is an Islamist and who has used her power as a school board member to advocate for all of this stuff, right? I mean, when they say, this actually is a point I want to take a little bit of a detour. One of the things that they advocate for is what they call resistance. So you and I are old enough to remember that the word the resistance, when I think of the resistance, we think of some Frenchman smoking a cigarette and wearing a beret who's in Paris in 1943 fighting the Germans. Okay, and that was an act of tremendous courage carried out by people who were not uniformed soldiers, but who fought soldiers and tried to sabotage evil people. The Palestinian campaign has stolen that word. And they characterize as resistance the slaughter of October 7th. They characterize as resistance all efforts to destroy the state of Israel. Sometimes they pretend that they're just criticizing individual actions by the state of Israel. But one of the fruits of the slaughter of October 7th is that people can now see what they are really about. They're not about two people living side by side in peace. They are about the destruction of the state of Israel, the murder of any Jew who has the chutzpah to live here, the torture and the commission of abominations against those Jews, so that all Jews will be broken. In the same way that I want unconditional surrender of Hamas, so that the Arabs who live there can live in peace with us.
Yes.
These people want to break the Jews of their desire to live in the state of Israel, to live anywhere on the territory of the land of Israel, right? It's not even that we could live here and be citizens of some other state. That's not what they mean. Sometimes that's what they say, but it's not what they mean.
No.
They want us gone. And it's important to understand that when the school board member in New Jersey or Michigan or California says, well, I'm encouraging students to support resistance, resistance means the slaughter of October 7th. That is what they mean by that word. And when I said we need unconditional surrender, I mean we need to break that.
This has been an amazing, amazing interview. I just want to add two things. Number one, I particularly hope our listeners will pay attention to what's happening in California with the ethical studies curriculum.
Ethnic studies curriculum.
Yes, sorry, yes. Ethnic studies, because it's a particularly horrifying example of when educators are being allowed to teach literally kill the Jews in education under an umbrella of supposedly educating our youth on, I don't know, something or other. So that's something that the Deborah Project is very much concerned with. We have cases throughout California, both challenging the substance of the liberated ethnic studies curriculum, and also demanding disclosure. I mean, one of the things, in some ways, it's good that the advocates for this stuff know that it's widely unpopular, and so one of the things that they do is hide the actual content. And yes, that's talking about the content of public school curricula. So you might think that since it's public school, it would be public, but they don't want to make it public because they know that it's unpopular, and it also happens to be illegal under California law. The executive director of the California Department of Education issued a letter about a month or two ago explicitly saying that the effort to introduce into the curriculum of ethnic studies courses in California these sorts of ideas that Zionism is a racist enterprise, that Israel is a country created by white supremacy, which is pretty ridiculous since most of the Jews who live here aren't white. Say that again. Most of the Jews who live in Israel
aren't white. Jews who live in Israel are not white. Most of the Jews who live in Israel are people from who have lived in the Middle East, families have lived in the Middle East for millennia. And were kicked out of
kicked
Yes.
out of
First of all, their families were kicked out of Israel by the Romans, and then they went to Iran, Iraq, Yemen, Egypt, Syria,
Tunisia, Morocco.
Morocco, and then in 1948, when the state of Israel was created, they were kicked out of those places and sent here. And they happened to compose, I believe, a slight majority of the Jewish population of the state of Israel. And their skin is just as dark as all the other people who live in those countries and have lived in those countries. They are people of color by any, horrible Nuremberg-oriented racist definition of whether you're a person of color. They're just as colorful as all the other people who live in those countries.
I like that.
And the only reason why they're not treated as people of color is because they're Jews. So the effort to get this idea across that Israel is a white country. The idea that you have to categorize countries as white or not white is bad enough, but factually, it happens to be false. But what they mean by white is bad. And the reason that they're bad and the reason that they're white is because they're Jewish. That's what's going on. And that's what's going on in the liberated ethnic studies world. And it's why the Deborah Project is fighting those cases throughout California and in other jurisdictions around the United States. So here again, you ask, what can your people do? Your viewers can be aware of both the efforts to propagate this stuff and also understand the vocabulary. When they say resistance, they don't mean the guy in Hogan's Heroes wearing a beret who's fighting the Nazis. They mean people who set Jewish babies on fire. They mean people who want to, and think it's justified, to murder and drive out every single Jew from the land of Israel. That's their idea of resistance. And October 7th has allowed us to take the mask off that, and they say it. They say, when we said decolonization, what did you think we meant? This is what they mean. And we need to understand that that is a mortal threat to us as Jews, to every Jew who lives in the land of Israel, and frankly, to Western civilization generally.
Yes, I feel very strongly that it's a threat to Western civilization. So I'm going to end it now, although I am going to say, if you watch Michael Berenbaum's video on the same channel, he gives us a lot of information how to answer some of the things that people are going to say to us now, as why doesn't Israel have more restraint? So for those answers, listen to his talk. And for the kinds of information that we gave, please spread this very important interview around to Jews and non-Jews so people really understand what's going on. Jerome, I thank you so much for calling in. Just to know, I didn't make him get up in the middle of the night. I got up early in LA so that he didn't have to. And, really, keep everyone, pay attention to what's going on. You do have a voice, and please use it.
Thank you for having me.
Israel will survive. We will.
Yes, Israel will survive and triumph. Absolutely.